Hello, everyone, and bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining Deloitte AI Institute Canada for today's very exciting panel discussion. Today, we're talking about generative AI in the government and public service sector. My name is Lisa Purdy, and I'm the Deloitte National Government and Public Services Leader in Consulting. And I'll tell you right off the top, I'm an imposter on this topic. I'm learning, as many of us are, the exciting potential this has, not only in our society, but in what we can do for our citizens through our government services. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Indigenous people of our lands. Deloitte Canada has offices with representation across most of the country and respects the role of our Indigenous peoples of the past, present, and future. This webcast for future reference will be recorded and made available on the Deloitte AI Institute webpage. You'll also be able to view the video in the official languages of your preference. So today we're talking a lot about generative artificial intelligence, known as generative AI. Many of our speakers will tell you much more about that. But what I'm here to tell you is there's a lot of global attention on this. It's in fact almost impossible to have missed discussions on this topic of late. But what's interesting is, of late, we've really seen how AI has stimulated the imagination of many on how we can use it to benefit society. It's also garnered a lot of discussion around the ethical, regulatory, legal, and intellectual property concerns, critical elements that we need to think in our government and public services sector as we advance its use in a responsible way throughout our country. There's no denying the era of AI is with us, but the real question is how responsible leaders in government and public service can harness its power to really improve how government operates itself and meets the needs of its citizens along the way. You know, a recent survey said an overwhelming 70% of business leaders support government investment in fundamental AI research, and we expect that to continue in 2024 and beyond. With this, it's pretty exciting what generative AI can do for us. And the best way to think about it is to think about the growing list of use cases in government and public service that can really not only capture the attention, but garner the impact that we're all looking for. These kinds of things we're going to look through today. You'll hear about whether or not it's having our public servants use generative AI to consider how we can plan new infrastructure projects in a very different way, address citizen queries, adjudicate bail hearings, triage healthcare services. We also need to think about how it is we can use it in a learner and experiential perspective, how we can deliver the educational experience within our government and public services in a very different way. For those of you who work in government public service, it could revolutionize the approach to talent management, recruitment, and career progression in an era of increasing competition for the highest and best talent in our country. It also allows us to imagine the possibilities in our life sciences and healthcare industry, whether it's advancing the process of drug trials or drug discovery, analysis of health records and medical data in a way that really allows us to think very differently about the individual needs of each person and advances their health and well-being. Of late, we've seen a massive shift in terms of generative AI tools. And part of that has been the accessibility of the end user interface, which is automated software engineering, making it faster and easier to develop digital solutions. And with this has come an ability to really develop unlimited engineering designs and test scenarios across public services to really see how we can, with speed and effectiveness, transform the impact we're having. Really, we're in an era that allows us to go from this is really cool technology to these are really meaningful impacts that we can have. And what we're going to try and do today is explore some of the use cases that allow us to get that meaningful impact, which is where we all want to be. To do this, we're going to focus on what we mean at Deloitte when we say Deloitte AI without context is meaningless. What does that mean for us? It means generative AI really needs to be put in the context of the most complex and challenging challenges of our country, whether that's help with modernizing of government, whether that's in back office transformation, of which our provinces, our federal government, our municipals, our agencies have struggled with for years, exploring the future of work for a more competitive talent landscape, meaningful financial disbursements and payments, all work that is core to government services that can be helped through a modernization agenda using generative AI. We can also help prepare the country for a future that's more sustainable and competitive. We need to bring those two dimensions together and think about ways to work differently to have a more impactful outcome. We also want to focus on the health, well-being, and security of Canadians and our Indigenous people. We know through that, it means we have to dramatically change the reach and longitudinal connection we have with peoples, as opposed to the transactional way in which services are delivered today. And generative AI can be a big piece of that puzzle. So in this webcast, we're going to dialogue with you about these kinds of dimensions. You're going to hear from our experts on what is generative AI, how enterprises and citizens can use the tool, and how do we get started. It's a massive concept, and we've got real and meaningful challenges right in front of us that we want to address. So with that, I'll turn it over from me as an imposter to our critical panelists for today. Let me just introduce them to you before I turn over the discussion. Advaya Boprakar, he leads Google's Canada's AI and machine learning practice for customer engineering. It's really focused on ensuring our customers can implement best-in-class AI with the help of Google Scale to realize business value. Advaya is not new to this world. He's had a previous career, whether it's with his work at IBM with Watson and AI, early in the generation of its application, also his work across the country in terms of applying this technique in many different industries. Richard Zuroff is a Senior Vice President of Growth at Blue Dot. It's a global infectious disease intelligence company that uses human and artificial intelligence to detect and assess the risks of emerging and endemic disease threats. Richard spent his career before at Blue Dot advising clients across a wide variety of industries through his work at McKinsey. He also has 2 law degrees, amongst other things, in his educational background. And as I said at the onset, we have to apply this for impact and apply it in the context of our regulatory, legal, and ethical environment. So Richard's background is certainly advantageous for that. Kurt Mumel, he is the Everyday AI Strategic Advisor at DataIQ, where he works with the organization and customer executives on the latest technology strategy and organizational topics related to AI. He's with the organization early on in its success, and he has previous roles in Chief Customer Officer, where he oversaw the organization's customers worldwide. He's got a career that spans the globe, as well as working in industry and in consultancy. Then I turn to some of our colleagues from Deloitte. Nahar Dalmia. Nahar is a partner in our Omnia AI practice, which is Deloitte's artificial intelligence practice. He leads our work in government and public service for AI. He specializes as not only envisioning the potential for the technology, but implementing it and building the analytic strategies for impact. He's also worked around the world. And I think it's critically important that at this time in our juncture, we don't only think about what's happening in Canada for government and public service, but through a global lens as well. Anand Mimkar leads our conversational AI and generative AI practices in Canada. And he looks at our partnerships with other organizations to make sure we're bringing the best of the ecosystem through which we can deliver these solutions. And last, but certainly not least, is our moderator. So Leanne Catalfo serves as our moderator today, and she also hails from our Omnia artificial intelligence practice, where she spends quite a bit of her time in the life sciences and healthcare sector, driving the best of our capabilities through to the most complex challenges in this industry. So with that, over to you, Leanne, for a great discussion.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome everyone. To kick things off, we're going to start with a poll to understand in what ways would you use generative AI in your organization. So you'll see here just on the left-hand side, there's a QR code that you can scan, or you can also join at slido.com with the code right there. And again, just thinking around what ways would you use generative AI in your organization? So we see some results starting to come through. Content, and that's actually one of the use cases that we will be exploring today as well. Content planning, dashboarding. Engineering design is popping up as well. Okay, content generation, proposal writing, planning, detection, data visualization. So as we can see, even just from some of the input that we're starting to receive, lots of varied applications around generative AI that could be used not only in your organization, but specifically as well within the government and public services sector. So with that, we'll maybe move to the next slide here just to introduce the session today. A couple of areas that we'll be exploring is we'll be starting off with part A, which is what is generative AI. Then we'll be moving to looking at how we can actually apply it in the government and public services sector. And then finally, we'll look at how to actually get started. And to the audience, we encourage you to ask questions throughout this event through the chat, and then we're happy to comment on that throughout. And in addition, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So to level set on this topic, we'll start with part A, and we'll hear from Anand on what is generative AI. Anand, over to you.
Hey, everyone. So generative AI at a high level is AI that can create things. It's typically trained on vast amounts of data, and the data that it generates is based on the data that was input. The primary interface is natural language, but the outputs could be images, code, video, audio, even robotics tasks. There have been some examples, great examples from Google, where you can ask a robot to go get you chips from a drawer, and it can work its way to the drawer and get the chips. It's essentially AI that is creating new data, and it's a very powerful paradigm because it's trained on essentially the entire internet's worth of data. It kind of encapsulates all of the knowledge that we have on the internet, and through that, it can actually generate useful advice, compelling images. Like I think the title slide of this session was generated by an AI. And it can power hyper-personalization at scale. Soon we will start to see video generation systems, which will allow us to dream up the next movie we want to watch, and have a blockbuster movie every night that's based on you. It's a powerful technology that's going to be impacting our world. It'll shape human behavior, and it will impact citizens across sectors. So how does it actually work? Like, what are the mechanics? At the core of it, at the very bottom, you kind of see this iceberg diagram. The very bottom is very specialized hardware, typically graphical processing units, or in the case of what Google does, specialized chips that can actually train AI models at scale. And then there's this vast amounts of data. If you can think about the engineering tasks required to scrape the internet of most of its data and store that data and use it to train a model, just a very monumental task from a storage perspective. And so it's typically cloud vendors that actually invest significantly in that. Then there's the models themselves. And models are, the primary input to those models are prompts. Prompts essentially just being text snippets. And the models generating outputs. Sometimes those outputs are parts of a process. Sometimes they are full outputs. And what we typically interact with and see, so like the ChatGPTs of the world, or some of the image generation systems, we see the interface, the application. And what an application is essentially a collection of prompts and or models with their outputs that are working together to create an application. And some of the terms we'll use in this session, you might hear us say LLM, which stands for large language model. Essentially, it's a large neural network that has been trained to generate text outputs, given an input text prompt or instruction. So it's essentially just text to text. The next one is text to image models. And those have been trained to generate images, given an input description or image. Nowadays, we're hearing a lot about multimodal models. The idea behind multimodalities is if you train large neural networks to learn like humans do, like we're not just trained on text when we, from babies. We are actually interacting with the world, right? We see things with our eyes, we touch things, we taste things. All of these are multiple modalities. And so in the multimodal training context, we're essentially training large neural networks with multiple modalities to generate across tasks. And it turns out when you do that, it ends up improving the performance of those models because they are able to apply concepts across modalities. And I think this is where the future is going to be with regard to generative AI. And we're already starting to see applications that can do that. So I'll hand it over to Leanne to continue the discussion here.
Yeah. Thanks, Anand, for that introduction. Now I'd like to turn it to the panelists to understand how the organizations that you are working with are thinking about or incorporating some of these generative AI solutions. Advait, we'll start with you. If you can share how Google is considering generative AI and its applications to GPS.
Yeah, for sure. I guess we're a little different than most companies in that we're kind of central to creating generative AI for the purpose of consumption. For the end user, we're not necessarily baking into, I mean, we are baking it into products, but our products are very much central to customers using them and enterprises using them. So when it comes to Google Cloud, we're thinking about how do we actually have and provide access to large language models and generative AI in general to the end user. But for a lot of our customers, they don't necessarily just need a plain model. Really what they want is a solution that's baked around it. So they may want generative functionality built into Gmail or their workspace where they're creating documents. They may want to have functionality built into bots, but bots have a lot of additional enterprise requirements around data security, data accesses. So we're really focused on building the core foundational technologies that are required for you to bake it into any number of use cases for the government public sector, but even in the private sector.
That's great, thank you. Kurt, as we think about data IQ, how are they thinking about generative AI, and are there specific use cases that are being considered?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are not familiar with Data IQ, what we are is a platform, a software platform that allows organizations, public and private sector, to develop their own capabilities on top of their data. Those could be traditional analytics, could be traditional machine learning, but it could also be more modern AI systems running within their environment or in the cloud environment that they use. And so what we see a lot of our customers looking into doing now, and I think it's important to emphasize that this is still early days for a lot of organizations, especially with generative AI. What they're looking into doing is exploring ways in which they can use this technology, to appropriate this technology in a way that's going to ultimately serve their business interests or the interests of the public in the event that they are a government or public service entity. The way that DataIQ allows for that, and what we're seeing in that customer base, is the use or the integration of these AI systems with their existing enterprise data or public data. They're integrating it also in some cases with more traditional machine learning techniques, kind of the traditional recommendation systems that have been in very common use for many, many years. This generative AI capability, and including those provided by Google and others, really allows you to develop a human-like interface to these otherwise somewhat sterile, somewhat cold systems. And so it's a really exciting way to see that there is a more wider opportunity to democratize the use of these systems, thanks to yet more AI systems built on top of them. And so it's a particularly exciting time to be working in the field. And then we see a lot of really relevant applications within the realm of government and public services.
Wonderful, thanks for that background, Kurt. And then moving along to Blue Dot. So Blue Dot really focuses on epidemiologic solutions that have been largely driven by traditional AI models. Richard, can you help us understand a little bit how Blue Dot is viewing generative AI?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So maybe I'll just spend a minute explaining what Blue Dot does to give a little bit of context. We're talking about how we're applying newer technology. So exactly as you said, so Blue Dot was founded to make the world a more resilient place to infectious diseases by providing better intelligence to analysts and decision makers in public health institutions and also the pharma and life sciences sector. So we're concerned broadly with outbreaks of new or known pathogens that can quickly move across the globe, as well as the increased burden of seasonal diseases like seasonal influenza or dengue, all of which can really weigh heavily on the domestic health and productivity of whole countries' populations. So to build that intelligence into our platform, we, as you said, have been using ML in a couple of ways already. So first, one thing that we've been doing for a while actually is to monitor the global media landscape in nearly every language for outbreak events that may or may not officially been reported yet. And so this is exactly the type of task that natural language processing is well suited for, And we've been using AI for a while to find and separate noise, like a song going viral, from real threat signals. And we're actually upgrading our more traditional NLP algorithms to use some of the large language models that are inside some of the generative AI tech for things like extracting the location of a disease event. The other place we use ML is on the forecasting side. So as some of the pharma and life sciences listeners will probably know well, it can take months to plan for the production and distribution of vaccines and therapeutics for each season. And so in-season forecasts may be really accurate, but they don't give you enough time to act. And similarly, if you're trying to do something like commercializing a novel product, so a new vaccine or a new indication, maybe for a tropical disease, you're going to be investing heavily in educating prescribers and maybe even consumers about those disease risks. So you don't necessarily want to rely on forecasts from years ago when that initial market sizing strategy work may have been done. So what we're thinking about is, what does continuous forecasting look like? So how do you link that surveillance of current disease activity on the one hand with a forward-looking view of what that can mean? And so we've been using some ML for forecasting, but with generative AI, we see this technology in two ways. So one is to really connect all of these data sets on the back end, and then second, to communicate back to the end user as an interface. So if you're a threat analyst at a public institution or a data scientist at a pharma company, rather than downloading data or even writing a simple API query of a couple of Blue Dot endpoints, with generative AI, you can just ask a question in natural language about our data and forecast and get a response back. And so for us, this creates the possibility of a simpler interface, a more natural interface with some of the unique data assets that we have, which is why we're really excited about a variety of applications internally for the technology.
That's great. Thanks, Richard. And then Nahar, you've been considering broader implications of generative AI. Can you share what Deloitte has been doing and some practical examples in this space?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Leanne. So before I get into a couple of examples of how generative AI is being used just broadly at Deloitte within our team in Omnia, we've got a very large team of data scientists, machine learning engineers who've been thinking about how to not just use generative AI, but use it responsibly. How do we make sure that we're teaching our clients on where's the most opportunities to use generative AI, where do you get the biggest bang for the buck? Because as with any new technology, any new advancement in AI, there's this temptation to start using it for everything and anything. And so we've been very focused on educating our clients on what generative AI is, what it's not, and how do you make sure that you use it to drive productivity and not just create redundancy. And we're seeing that a lot of our clients are also waiting and watching to see what applications really surface up as the ones that are most likely to add value. And others who are starting to use generative AI to drive some quick wins. We're seeing applications where our clients want to improve citizen experience through the use of virtual assistants by embedding generative AI in a responsible way, such that you can start to drive better experience, better productivity for both citizens as well as for government employees. And then places where generative AI could be used for doing classifications of large number of unstructured documents and determine what it's about. So we're seeing a cautious but very optimistic approach of using generative AI, which we believe is the right way to go. Now, onto a couple of examples. Government of Iceland is starting to do something really interesting. So one of the issues broadly across the world we're seeing is, how do you make sure that we preserve languages, especially traditional languages that require preservation as more and more, as there's more globalization. And so the government of Iceland has been working with OpenAI to figure out, how do you, as people are using ChatGPT or other generative AI tools, how do you make sure that the language of their native language is preserved by using the right data set to train these models. So how do you make sure there's the right grammar, spelling, cultural context when generative AI is used? And so their hope is that by doing that, not only are they opening these generative AI tools to people within the country, but also then inspiring others to use this approach so that there's good language preservation. And then if you go to the next example, I also wanted to highlight Government of Singapore. So one of the challenges we've seen with government employees is that they spend a lot of time writing, whether it's crafting policies, writing contracts, creating briefs, responding to parliamentary queries, or queries from other parts of the government, and queries from citizens. There's a lot of work done, which is highly manual and cumbersome. And so imagine a world where you can get generative AI to help draft policy papers or write contracts or write briefs on specific topical issues, at least as a starting point. Imagine a world where generative AI can look at news across social media to see reactions to certain policies. We're already seeing generative AI being used to craft speeches or look at regulations and understand where are there redundancies or overlaps. And as I said, we are looking at use cases where generative AI is being used to potentially respond to citizens. So Government of Singapore recently announced that they will be testing the use of a civil servant assistant that would work side by side with government employees to free up time from these officers for higher level tasks. So it could help them write first draft for letters, briefs, speed up their work by creating sample emails or even speeches. And in addition, also do things like do redactions in documents, which can be really powerful if you think of it, if that can really be scaled. And so, it's really interesting to see Government of Singapore take this proactive way to start to test these tools in real world scenarios, but also in sort of relatively safe environments to see how it works and improve over time. So I'll pause there, but there's lots of examples, Leanne, where we're seeing governments starting to test generative AI. But I see one of the questions in the chat. It is really important to make sure that we're using it in a responsible way, testing and learning and improving, and always making sure that we're following the right regulations.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Nahar. And exactly, so in the chat, for those that can't see, the question really is around the Privacy Commissioner of Canada announced an investigation into the company behind ChatGPT today. So, and I don't know if you want to add anything else around how this could potentially impact the use of ChatGPT and other generative AI solutions in the public sector.
I think right now, governments around the world are scrambling to come up with regulations and legislation to kind of cover this topic. And I would say that, these tools, the number of active users of ChatGPT far exceeds any other application in history in terms of its growth rate, right? So in the first 5 days, I believe they hit 1 million active users. In the first, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was faster than, Instagram or TikTok or Facebook. And the issue is when people are interacting with these systems, some of them are actually sharing information. So they're sharing their personal information, their names, their addresses. They may be sharing their health information, asking questions about, symptoms around specific things. These systems are quite powerful. Many of them are able to answer in even very specialized domains, like in the medical domain. And so there needs to be a privacy framework, applied to companies that are actually opening up applications here, right? Because, how is that data being redacted when it's sent in? Is that data being used to train the underlying models? Because in the current context with these applications that are public facing, those prompts, the things that you enter into them, can be used to train those underlying models, right? So I think it's an appropriate time to start asking the question around this type of stuff. And companies like Google and even Microsoft with with their OpenAI service on Azure versus the OpenAI APIs, which are kind of direct through OpenAI, there are additional safeguards put in place around the data and how it gets shared. The data used to prompt the models, the data used to fine tune them, and how it gets shared back into those core foundational models for training. And I think going forward in any context with any type of deployment, from an enterprise context or from a government context, there should be like data should be one of the first class concerns, in addition to other things like cybersecurity and additional regulatory risk.
Thank you for that, Anand, and helpful considerations as we will start to move into the next part of the session here, where we'll really take a deeper dive into a sample set of use cases that are being explored, where a lot of these considerations are very applicable. So to preface, this is not an exhaustive list of use cases for generative AI. What we'll be doing is just providing a sampling of what you can start to see or have already started seeing across the sector. So the first one here that we'll start to explore is around citizen support chatbots. So public organizations offer valuable support to Canadians and newcomers as well. However, there are significant barriers when accessing different services and resources. Many of these barriers are due to long wait times, potentially overwhelming amounts of information, and just how to actually navigate some of the services that are offered. So citizen support chatbots, they leverage machine learning algorithms and they provide tailored responses based on user inputs to improve accessibility to information for Canadians in multiple languages, which is again becoming increasingly more important. I'll open it up to each of our panelists to understand how the organizations that you are working with are considering this application of generative AI and what this could look like or is starting to look like in practice.
Sure, I'll maybe get started. So Google is going to be providing and has provided bot platforms for customers. So we have the public sector, healthcare sectors, as well as the private sector that's been using it today. So this is not necessarily a net new use case that's being unlocked. It's more so that the barrier of effort required to execute upon it effectively is considerably lower because you don't have to go through the process of curating flows and knowledge as explicitly as you had to do in the past. That being said, I think there's some general misunderstandings about the best usage patterns for large language models in this context. People think that what they're really good at is memorizing large quantities of data that they can play back to you. That's actually not necessarily the best way to think about it. The better way to think about it is that these are models that are generalized in language-based tasks, and when required, they can retrieve information that's relevant. Now, why is that an important distinction? Well, today, if you play around with a lot of these generative models, perhaps they're correct 70% of the time. The other remaining 30% of the time, they'll very happily lie to you, or what we're calling hallucinations. So that's not necessarily a useful bot, in which case you're not necessarily certain how well it's going to perform. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to resolve there. So one is that groundedness in fact, retrieving information in real time and trying to ground it in that context. That drastically improves the likelihood that it's going to provide you factual information, though is not a guarantee of fact. But I think there's other challenges that users are going to have to be educated in, particularly understanding the usage patterns of these models. Oftentimes it's really easy to think that, well, you just have to ask a very basic, simple natural language question, and that predominantly is the case. But there is a bit of a science or an art to prompting at the moment. There's even careers around what we're now calling prompt engineers. You can see postings of that in Silicon Valley for very large sums of remuneration, just to understand how should you speak to these models to be precise. And the problem is language, while the most precise form of communication we have, is not really that precise in many natures. So a good example of this is I was testing, Google has multiple different image generation models, and I was testing a couple different prompts between the two to compare how they perform. So one of the prompts I said was, I wanted it to generate a Polaroid photo of a corgi on a desk. Now, one model generated a Polaroid photo. Inside of that photo was a corgi, and that corgi was sitting on a desk. The other model generated a Polaroid photo of a corgi, but the Polaroid was what was on the desk. Language is not necessarily clear in specifying what the user's intent was. So the behavior of the model was completely different. So you kind of have to understand how the models work. There's another example of this that happened to me this weekend. I was doing a bit of gardening when we had some good weather here in Toronto. And I told my wife to take the thingy and put it in the thingy over there, which as a sentence like makes no sense to any of you. The reality is that language is not necessarily purely linguistic. We understand things from the context of a physical space and embodiment. So she completely understood that I meant that I wanted her to take the rake and place it back in the shed, but there was a context associated with that sentiment. So the question is language the only way that we can solve these problems, or do we need to build in some amount of multimodality and understanding beyond just language to make these effective?
That's great. Kurt, from Data IQ's perspective, would you like to comment on the citizen support chatbot solution?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think one first advocate that those are some great examples, and the the ability for humans to actually communicate, given the way that we speak with one another, is really impressive. And I think that that's one of the most impressive things about these new models is that we can interact with them in natural language, which makes them feel intelligent. It makes it feel to us as if we're interacting with something that has certain human-like qualities, which the fact that that exists is really exciting. And I think applications like this support chatbot for citizen services is potentially extremely powerful. Just to share a personal anecdote, about 20 years ago, I immigrated from the United States to France. And as anyone who's changed country knows, when you're first arriving in that new country is when you need a lot of services from your government. You need to set up all sorts of different things. It's also the period when you may be learning the language. And so the ability to interact with a system that understands your native language, regardless of how rare your language may be, and is able to provide that interface back to the actual knowledge contained in all the different data systems by the government, or in all the historical responses provided by support agents through more traditional means, could be extremely powerful and create a connection between that citizen and their new government. For example, if I'm continuing with my immigration story, that really is one that can develop a positive bond with that experience. Now, there is reason to be cautious, many reasons to be cautious when pursuing this. As Ed just described, right? We cannot guarantee that these systems are factual unless we're actually providing them with the fact that we want them to then give to the end user. The good news is it's possible to do that, and by combining more traditional systems with these more modern systems, you could design systems which are both natural in the way that they interact with the user, the citizen in this case, but also in which you can have a high degree of confidence that what they're responding in the way that they're responding is appropriate. That said, doing so takes time. Doing so will take effort, but it is a really exciting development. I would also, though, caution for any application like this, especially citizen support, it's possible that a citizen will be coming to you with a topic that you don't want a chatbot to be handling, that you absolutely need a human being to be handling. And I think that that's a really good example where you need to have systems in place that essentially raise an alarm and bring a human back into the loop at a moment's notice to ensure that in a case of life or death, security, safety, that the person who has found their way to that chat interface is able to get the urgent services, the human support that they may need based on the nature of their request. But again, those are solvable technical problems. Really what's needed are systems to ensure that the design of that technology, of the implementation of that technology, is taking into account these edge cases and is, of course, being respectful towards everyone who might be interacting with those systems, and of course aware that there could be really challenging edge cases that you want to handle differently than via an automated system.
Thanks, Kurt. Maybe Richard, we'll move along to you.
Yeah, so at Blue Dot, we don't support citizens as end users directly, but we do support a couple of different profiles like border safety or travel within public health that this is pretty relevant to. So if you think about travel health and protecting Canadians who are going abroad, we want them to understand what infectious disease risks they should plan for in the countries that they are visiting. And so the traditional approach from government websites and also the enterprise travel market for employees who are traveling has been a pretty static approach to building country risk profiles. So just providing information on what diseases are endemic and that can be updated every few years. And then sometimes maybe a pretty noisy news feed of everything that might be happening. So that isn't a perfect solution. At the same time, you can't ask like a raw chat GPT or similar tools, things like what are the current year-to-date cases of Zika in Brazil, or has the amount of disease exceeded historical baselines, or how bad is this season expected to be? These models, when they come out of the box, don't have access to those types of insights. And there are training date cutoffs that I think many of you may have found when playing around with these tools. And that contributes to some of those information retrieval challenges that Advait had mentioned. So internally at Blue Dot, we've spent a lot of time doing data engineering and pipeline to create some structured data sets that are accessible via API. And so we're excited about the releases that give generative AI access to APIs via connectors. So now with that, you could imagine a travel analyst asking via like a chat interface saying, are dengue cases in the Dominican Republic above expected levels in January or February? And that's the type of dynamic output that I could imagine being passed on to snowbirds. I'm not lucky enough to be one, but if I was going back and forth from the cold weather to the warm weather, I would really want to know what's my risk profile right now based on the latest information versus just what is it like in general. And that move to a much more dynamic engagement with the current environment is something that's enabled by generative applications. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Richard. And maybe lastly, Nahar, if there's any additional insights that you want to provide on this generative AI solution.
Yeah, I'll go quick because I think those were great comments from Richard and Kurt. Absolutely spot on. Chatbots have existed for many, many years. They've, if you think about chatbots at Q&A, that was where it was. And now we're really thinking of chatbots more as virtual assistants or intelligent assistants. That's how we should really be thinking about generative AI and the use of chatbots. So I'll just offer two examples. To move from those Q&A type of chatbots to chatbots that are much more intelligent, you want to embed as much personalization as possible. And generative AI can help drive that personalization by really thinking about, what are the characteristics of that individual that you're talking to, based on their preferences, past interactions, but also the general sort of persona of that person. And so that creates a stronger relationship between the user and the assistant to improve the user satisfaction. But then to the point made earlier, it's important then to know what's the right handoff to a human so that it's there's a seamless experience. And then the second example I'll offer is, you still want to be able to use virtual assistants to be able to triage. So you want to be able to divert common issues away from human intervention so you can focus on the sort of the key issues that require a human to solve for. And so one of the ways to think about using generative AI in chatbots is where can you find opportunities to reduce response time and improve the efficiency of overall the support process.
Okay, great. So then as we transition to another use case, employee training and onboarding experience, it's a very valuable retention tool. However, the high cost of resource production can often lead to training content that is generally just very generic, expensive, and not relevant to the actual need at hand. Training development and learning delivery is another use case here in which generative AI can be used to support different organizations. So we'll start maybe with Advait on how does this application of generative AI deliver incremental value to the organizations you work with or the government and public service sector as a whole?
Yeah, and I think that this applies generally to the idea of education. So a couple of weeks ago, I was doing a panel at OISE and the UFT around education and generative AI. My personal opinion is I think we need to rethink education from the ground up as it is. Like we're too focused on test scores as opposed to learning outcomes. And the personalization that can come through generative AI is where there's a lot of value. We can be very pointed in terms of filling the knowledge gaps that people have. I know during COVID, especially in areas like call centers, there was a large amount of turnover, and to educate someone to get ready to take on that role was time consuming and expensive. So can we actually also reduce the barrier of entry that it takes to get people ready by giving them real-time support on jobs? So not necessarily just focusing on onboarding, but thinking about that onboarding as well as job support that reduces how much skill you need to have to take something on. I also think that this is generally just going to level the playing field for a lot of people. So, I know some teachers, they're immigrants to Canada, but even though they're completely fluent in English, because they're ESL, it's a cause of anxiety for them, right? So they'll constantly be rechecking and checking every single thing that they write before they send it off. And I think through generative AI being something that can support them through the process of generating content, it'll allow them to be just that much more efficient.
Thank you. Kurt?
Yeah, just very briefly, a lot of Dataiku customer organizations that we work with use our software, but more importantly, use various techniques to apply them to their HR. And often, what they're looking to do is just really optimize the employee experience to ensure that that employee stays with that organization for as long as possible. And what they've discovered is that it's relatively straightforward to be able to understand what causes an employee to have a good experience and to stay versus leaving for a different opportunity. And so I'm really excited about opportunities where generative AI can do just what Anant was describing and really personalize that content, because it's one thing to recommend that you should really go through this, this next training course or this next e-learning course, which is better than nothing. At least we're getting a recommendation. At least it's relevant. But when that's just showing up in what seems like a form email without a lot of personalization, that's not very engaging. Imagine now you have a custom instructor, really a video avatar that's generated in real time with human-like voice that feels like they care about you, that feels like they know you, and they're making that same recommendation. That's a future that I'm excited about.
Great. Richard?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So our founder, Dr. Cameron Khan, is a physician who spent decades in clinical practice and research understanding infectious diseases. But most doctors only get a few hours of training throughout their entire medical education. And when they're in practice seeing patients, they really only want the type of information that's extremely relevant and timely for them. So like, what are the risks to my patient population? What diseases might they have? What are the medical countermeasures that are scientifically validated to treat it to the best effect? And so traditionally, we would think about training to be in the context of sort of taken out of clinical practice and being in continuing medical education courses. But with generative AI, we can think about, again, making that much more dynamic. So if we bring it back to Blue Dot for a second, we provide alerts and assessments of outbreaks or other events of interest, like a disease establishing itself in a new location, which might have a highly susceptible population. So this is something that local physicians would really want to know about. So it would be a natural fit to have a much more dynamic continuing education experience to let a physician ask, like, what do I need to know about this disease? What products are indicated for it? And to have the whole vast medical literature about it be summarized for them, rather than expecting doctors everywhere to become experts on Marburg virus or polio or the latest things that are approved. The flip side of this is also the consumer education side. So obviously that's a highly regulated space, but you can also think about what does it mean to create these types of interfaces. And so there, I think you don't want the type of model that's just been trained on the web. I know I've made the terrible mistake of looking up symptoms online. And so we know there's a lot of dubious medical information that's out there. So we want to have the opportunities to really make these be very focused. I saw a recent news report about Bloomberg releasing Bloomberg GPT for financial data, right? And that's something that's taken pre-trained models and then retrained in a really specific domain. And as you'd expect, they do really well on things like financial sentiment analysis, and that can help train new equity analysts. And I think it's the same thing in other domains like epidemiology, where Blue Dot works.
Great examples, Richard. And Anant.
Yeah, so I just wanted to very quickly add here too that like the capabilities that some of these generative AI solutions are exhibiting effectively lower the barriers to knowledge work, right? So if you want to create new stuff, you can work with a model and do it a lot faster. I saw many examples of people who have never coded anything ever, have been working with GPT-4 and actually building software, even complex software, together with GPT-4. So if you can think about it as an extension of your brain in a way, and it kind of goes it goes much further beyond traditional means of search, where it's actually understanding your context, and it can do that at scale for many people. And then almost extending their thinking or giving them having a bidirectional interaction with them to actually create net new things faster.
Great. And our last use case here looks at content summarization. So public institutions generate volumes of valuable structured and unstructured data each year, but the resources are not readily synthesized or available for quick search and consumption. So with more and more training data now available, the summarization of contents, including different things like publications and policies, it can be enriched to really help increase transparency and provide insights to support with decision-making within government and public service. Advait, we'll start with you again, but how are organizations considering this application of generative AI?
Yeah, and I think everyone has a similar problem that I do. I get a deluge of emails every single day, and there's a massive amount of content that I need to consume to be able to do my job. So I think something like this that can summarize things down to the key points, so I can be more effective in consuming that content and being productive is a nice value add. But I think it's important that we consider what socioeconomic and cultural impacts that this could have. There's a comic going around on the internet right now. If someone types in a bullet point, it creates an email for them and sends it to the recipient. The recipient uses the AI to then summarize that email back into a bullet point. And the question is like, what are we doing when we're living in this like information compressed age where we don't actually know the details and we're just using the shortcut hack to consume everything? We already have a problem. This happens to me all the time where someone will say, "Oh, did you see that article about X thing?" And I was like, "Tell me about the article." I was like, "I didn't read it. I just saw the title." Well, okay, what are we going to do about that as a society if this becomes pervasive? I think it's a fantastic technology. I think it's going to be leading to a lot of benefits, but I think there's also some challenges along the way until we establish kind of a norms of how to use it effectively.
Great. Kurt?
Yeah. So I think, this is a task that these large language models really excel at. It's one of the use cases that I personally use them for when I have, something complex and I want to ask the system, this automated tool to give me its version of the summary. I do find that helpful. And I think that it can be particularly relevant when the text or the document that needs to be summarized is in a, let's call it a format or written in a style which somebody is not familiar with. For example, a law or a contract, right? They have a very particular style that can be very dense, and it can be very hard for a layperson to understand what they're really talking about. At the same time, I think that it is important to ensure that there is the ability to go to the original source to really make sure that you can dive in to that original detail. Because again, if we're living in this world of, as we just heard, compressed information, I think it's important to have that decompression option as well, so we can go in and look at the original source whenever we need to. But it's definitely something that can be a great time saver and can be really helpful to people who either are not experts and are looking at expert information, or who simply don't have the time to learn how to read a dense contract. And those applications are equally relevant in the public as they are in the private sector.
Okay, great. Richard or Nahar, anything else to add to content summarization?
Yeah, I mean, maybe briefly. So as Kurt mentioned, summarization is a great use case, and it's something we're doing a lot of, especially in terms of scanning unstructured media or text for hints about risks. But I think it is important to emphasize, at least for us, summarization is really an opportunity for human augmentation and not full automation. And in the context of Blue Dot, the reason for that is if you think about a summary saying that like X event happened in Y place, that's actually pretty different than assessing whether this is a high risk or a low risk event. And by definition, these outbreak events are new, they're novel. And so they're not well suited to the type of pattern matching or classification that those types of algorithms do well. And I think it was mentioned before, around the hallucination risks, right? And that's something that we really have to manage in this context as well. So the underlying algorithms here are about next token prediction and next sentence prediction. So you don't want the output to be, this is a plausible sounding summary of the event. You want to say, this is what has actually happened. So we need to either constrain models to only produce correct text, or to always have an expert human in the loop who's reviewing the answers. And that's the approach that we've taken here. But then once you have those types of guardrails in place, you can think about having your in-house EPIs, or maybe people in your SOC, or even supply chain risk managers really spending more time digging into the implications of an event. So starting with that summary, but then augmenting that. So they're spending their time thinking about, where might it spread, or just what impact is this actually going to have on my business or on my institution once it gets there, rather than the initial information processing. So yeah, a great use case.
Okay, excellent. So these are just a couple of examples of use cases to bring this to life. But maybe if we just ask a question to all the panelists very briefly, if you can comment with the dynamic changes that are happening across the sector, can you share your perspectives on how organizations can get started? So Abby, we'll start with yourself.
Sure, I think there's a number of different places you can get started. And there's plenty of commercial providers that are trying to build these foundational technologies, Google being one of them, but by no means the only. There are players in the market who are embedding these same capabilities directly into their products to simplify workflows you may have already procured. And there are open source opportunities where you can take models, if you have data science teams, to do fine tuning, and if that's economically viable for you to do. So I think there's a number of different ways. Google's constantly releasing things, whether it be inside a workspace for Google Meet, for documents, for Gmail, as well as for enterprises that need to train and consume models and bots.
Kurt?
Yeah. And so I think I would encourage anyone who's looking to get started with AI to actually start with a more fundamental question of why. It's important to remember that AI is a tool like any other. It has its application, but it's not a cure-all, right? And so I think that there's in many cases where more traditional data techniques might be relevant. But if you are sure that what you need to solve the business problem that you have in front of you is AI, then well, there's a lot of great resources out there. And Advait just mentioned some great ones. Dataiku provides training materials and information for getting started. And I would really recommend to reach out to some of the organizations that provide that expertise. Obviously, Deloitte and Blue Dot do that as well, because there are ways to avoid those pitfalls. We don't have time to go into all of those here, but a short conversation can save months of headache. So do ask around, but also always start with why. What are you trying to accomplish or improve for your business?
Thanks, Kurt. Richard.
Yeah, not a lot to add. I think those are great answers. Yeah, just really emphasizing that, yeah, rather than starting with the solution of saying, what can I do with generative AI, start with the outcomes that you're trying to drive, and then work backwards from there to the types of technologies that can be helpful.
Nahar or Anand, anything else to add?
Quick thing and perfect transition. I'd say learn as much as possible, understand the art of the possible. We have a offering called the Generative AI Lab, which does exactly that demystifies technology and explores opportunities and risks of using generative AI and focus on some of those quick wins. So experiment, learn, and try, test it out, because we are really optimistic about what generative AI can do. It's always good to be cautious as well.
Great. I'll pass it over to Aisha from our AI Institute now, just to close off the session.
Thank you to everyone who's participated in this session, and also thank you to the panelists for giving some insightful guidance on some of the use cases. As you know, we don't do our job unless we get some data points from you to understand how you have learned from this session and also improvements that we can make to our sessions moving forward. So if you can take a few minutes to answer this poll that has just popped up onto the screen, and we'd like to just share with you some other exciting news in terms of our webcast series that are coming forward in the next couple weeks on generative AI. So we will be delving into consumer and TMT on the 18th, and then followed that by energy and resources and industrials on the 25th, along with our other series of webcasts that are coming forward as well. So please stay tuned, and please always look to engage with us if you have any questions regarding this webcast, and we will be sending an email out if you do want to follow up with any of the participants in this webcast to have further questions. So again, thank you so much for attending this session, and we will leave the poll up for a few more minutes for you to engage and have your responses just reflected. And with that, wishing everybody a great rest of your day and week ahead.